Justice Brandeis wrote that the calling of the press is very high. It is almost holy. I remember the first time I read those words, and I've never forgotten them. And I believe they're true. The role of the media in our society is incredibly significant. It would be hard to assess just how important it is. And good journalists, and we have good journalists in this city, are to be valued. Our speaker has a most impressive background in his chosen profession. One of the things that has always impressed me is anybody who writes for Foreign Affairs, the most important journal of its kind in the world, and he has written for Foreign Affairs many, many times. He developed a significant following as a columnist for the Union-Tribune. That relationship is now ended, and in part today he will explain to us why. Will you welcome, please, Mr. James Goldsborough.
Well, thank you so much. It's a real honor to be here among so many friends, see so many faces, and to be able to address people who belong both to the Catfish Club and the City Club. I see also some former colleagues from the Union-Tribune, and I hope they'll understand my remarks. I'm now a free man. I cannot be censored. I can say what I damn well please. The San Diego Union-Tribune, in my view, is a newspaper, a monopoly newspaper in decline, and I want to comment on why I left that newspaper and why I think it's in decline. The resignation came on a matter of principle, which was a killed column. The story of my resignation was carried nationally in some 100 newspapers, though not in the Union-Tribune itself, which does not cover news it does not like. I believe the public has the right to know the reasons for my departure and, in general, the situation of the newspaper. Having left the newspaper, I'm free to speak out. During a long career in this business, I've always thought of daily newspapers as privately owned public companies, institutions with a deep responsibility to the communities they serve. Newspapers are not in business just for shareholders, or in the case of the Union-Tribune, just for the owner. They're in business for readers, something I remarked to the Union-Tribune editor who does not share that view. Edmund Burke was the first to refer to the press as the fourth estate, by which he meant that it was equal in power to the other three estates, which in the American context would be the three branches of government. It's a strange formulation because I've always thought of the press as a counterpower. Not a power, a counterpower. We're not there to assert ourselves so much as to prevent others from excesses of assertion. This counterpower is particularly necessary in times of abuse of power. For example, the launching of an illegal war based on public deception. When a newspaper as an institution declines to play its role as a counter or countervailing power, it is especially important that its independent voices, that is, its opinion commentators, preserve that fundamental journalistic role. As the Los Angeles Times said in the headline of its story about my resignation, quote, "Dissenting voices help make newspapers strong." The Union-Tribune has existed in its present form for 13 years, or since the merger of the Tribune, the morning newspaper, and the Union, the Tribune, the evening newspaper, and the Union, the morning newspaper, which were both owned by Copley. The merger presented the newspaper and this city with a unique opportunity. The circulation of the new newspaper in early 1992 was 382,000 daily, which made it third largest in the state behind the Los Angeles Times and the San Francisco Chronicle. But if the Union-Tribune started with 382,000, the anticipation was that it would grow much larger. The immediate goal was to pass 400,000, which was within reach, and with San Diego's population growth and San Francisco's population decline, meant the Union would soon pass the Chronicle and become the state's second newspaper. 1 year after the merger, the news got even better, or so some thought. On November 6, 1992, the Los Angeles Times closed its San Diego edition, ending a 14-year-long attempt to become a San Diego newspaper. Jerry Warren, the editor of the Union-Tribune at the time, held a meeting in the city room, and there was great cheering. We'd beaten the Times. The Times' 61,000 San Diego circulation would transfer to the Union-Tribune's 382,000, and we would have 443,000 circulation. Except it didn't work out that way. Not at all. I date the Union-Tribune's decline from the day the Times pulled out. San Diego went from being a competitive newspaper city to a monopoly newspaper city. Without competition to measure itself by, a newspaper's only accountability comes from the professionalism of its management. Would the Union-Tribune's management be up to the job? 1 decade later, we have the answer. The Union-Tribune did not pick up the Times' 61,000 San Diego readers. Circulation nudged up briefly and has been sinking ever since. In the past year alone, the Union-Tribune lost 26,000 circulation, or 7.3% of its total. Its present declared circulation is 327,000, and the real figure may be lower. As the city grows, the newspaper shrinks. Household penetration is barely 30%. As a business institution making its money on advertising, not circulation, the newspaper does fine, just as long as declining circulation doesn't eventually affect advertising, which it inevitably must. The Union-Tribune is successful as an advertising business, though it is a failure as a newspaper serving its community. And why is that? Because too many San Diegans do not trust the Union-Tribune. They don't trust it to report and comment on the news honestly for the community as a whole, free of bias, free of a private agenda. Take my resignation, for example. You could read about it in more than 100 newspapers, in a long Sunday piece in the Los Angeles Times, on dozens of internet sites, hear about it on local radio and television. You could read the killed article itself on the internet. You could read the article in the National Jewish Weekly, the foreword, under the headline, right on the front page, under the headline, "Too Hot for San Diego, Why Jews Voted for Kerry." It makes the nation's finest city look just a little bit provincial. You were deprived of the story because the Union-Tribune's editors decided not to print the news. If the New York Times motto is all the news that's fit to print, I suggest the Union-Tribune's motto should be the news is what we say it is. You could not even read the story in the weekly column of the Union-Tribune's reader's representative or ombudsman. In San Diego, the reader's representative does not represent the readers. She represents the publisher. As my emails from disgruntled readers closed in on 1,000 last week, I called the reader's representative. I said, "A reader's revolt is underway, you know." She said, "Yes, I know." Here is the professional issue I resigned over. David Copley did not have the right to kill my column. He had the right to fire me, which by killing the column he effectively did, though he didn't seem to know that. I have no idea why Copley even saw the column. I worked for Kay Graham twice in my career, on the International Herald Tribune owned by the Post and on Newsweek owned by the Post. Her success in newspapers and magazines, she used to say, was due to hiring good editors and letting them do their jobs. Copley should not have seen the column because he clearly misunderstood it. Why would he understand it? He doesn't come to the newspaper anymore. Columns of regular staff columnists are never killed, even by editors. Sometimes editors ask questions, sometimes they suggest changes. That's their job. I have nothing against editors. I've been an editor. Killing columnists, killing columns is not one of their responsibilities. The one exception I know to that, others might know some, but this is the only one I've ever heard of, was the killing of Scotty Reston's column on the coming Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. And in that case, Reston was on the phone with President Kennedy and Punch Sulzberger and agreed to hold it, to kill it. In retrospect, both Kennedy and the Times wished they hadn't killed the column. They wished they'd published it and saved us from one of our stupider foreign policy mistakes. Though not one, I would add, that can even hold a candle to the invasion of Iraq. My column did not involve the invasion of Cuba or of Iraq or any other place. It was an analysis of why the Jewish vote last month in the election went to John Kerry. Copley's reason for killing it, which was passed on to me by the editor, he thought it might be offensive to some people. Well, la-di-da. Imagine that. Columnists being offensive to some people. Doesn't Copley think that all the right-wing drivel that's published in the Union-Tribune is offensive to some people? And offensive to whom? Certainly not to Jews, who published the article in one of their own national newspapers and posted it all over their websites. My column was primarily offensive to Republicans, for I tried to explain, through the words of a longtime Jewish friend of mine, why 3 out of 4 Jewish votes in the past election went to John Kerry. In killing the column, Copley guaranteed it would reach a national audience. Most of the 979 emails, and I answered them all, well, I answered all but about 15, which were not answerable, because they took the other side, 15 out of 979. Most of them asked to see the killed column, and I referred them all to the website where I'd sent it. It got much more exposure than it ever would have been had it run in the newspaper. Censors never seem to learn. At the Union-Tribune, the publisher controls the editorials, he controls the reader's representative, he controls the cartoonist, and he controls the letters to the editor. He thought he controlled this columnist too, and he was wrong. When David Shaw of the Los Angeles Times, one of the most respected media critics in our nation, called the Union-Tribune editor and called the publisher for comment on the killed column, for comment on the story, which was now a national story, they refused to talk to him. The editor refused to talk to Shaw about a national issue involving her newspaper. The publisher's secretary referred him to the company lawyer. Well, I'm not suing the Union-Tribune. It's not suing me. This wasn't an issue for lawyers. This was a journalism issue. Not just to the 979 readers who wrote to me last week, not just to the 368 letters that came into the Union-Tribune, of which 5 were published. 5 of 368. They owed an explanation, the editor and publisher, to the entire community, and they've not said a word. Their only answer was silence, which is a very strange form of communication for a newspaper. Now, why doesn't the Union-Tribune get it? The fundamental newspaper job is news. Beyond just the facts comes what I was involved in these last few years, which is opinion. And in that role, the newspaper job is as the community's primary watchdog and a national watchdog when it comments on national issues. A fearless and independent voice that speaks to power, whether it is Republican or Democratic power, offending power when necessary, challenging it when necessary, putting the interests of fairness and balance ahead of party politics and private agendas. That is the job of of newspapers. As an opinion columnist, I sat on the Union-Tribune's editorial board, which has lost its two best editorial writers this year, which you probably don't know. And now it's lost me. So it's less of an editorial board than perhaps an editorial plank or maybe a splinter for the moment. But I saw the things that happened, and I can comment on them. Let me mention some specific things I know about. The essential problem at the Union-Tribune is that it is headless. It is leaderless. The problem starts at the top, except there is no top. Have you ever heard of a metropolitan daily with no managing editor? With no executive editor? With no associate editor? Have you ever heard of a metropolitan daily with no local columnist? Now, Peter Rowe is here. Peter is a great feature columnist. Lionel Van Deerlen, my colleague on the editorial page, is here. But we don't have and Neil Morgan is here, the man who hired me and brought me down here. Don Bowder, unfortunately, is not here. He writes for another newspaper. But it doesn't have a local columnist. Now, we're probably not going to produce a Mike Royko or a Jimmy Breslin or a Murray Kempton or another Neil Morgan. But a newspaper deserves to have a local columnist, somebody who looks into all the crevices, all the undusted little dirty places that a city has, and publishes that stuff no matter who it offends. That's what a local columnist does. Steve Lopez at the Los Angeles Times was my colleague for years on the Mercury News, now in San Jose. Now, with all due respect to San Jose, it's not a real city, so he didn't stay there. He went on to Philadelphia, and then he came back to Los Angeles. And he's a digging local columnist, 5 columns a week. And if we had one here, believe me, you'd know some things about the city you don't know. By limiting the chain of command, the Union-Tribune eliminates dissent. Why are the people I've mentioned, like Neil Morgan and Don Bowder and now me, three of the main dissenting columnists, why have they all left the newspaper recently? Well, I just told you, because they couldn't stand the pressure to conform. They couldn't stand Don Bowder talked to him about this sometime. The number of columns that he was pressured to change, particularly on the ballpark. You probably know that story. Now let me tell you something about the opinion pages, which is where I served. Opinion pages have different spaces for different contributors. The way it works on most newspapers is that the publisher has his space right under the masthead on the left, the unsigned editorials, unsigned. The cartoonist has his space, which is right next to the editorials. The columnists have their space. The reader's representative has his or her space once a week to tell you the truth about the things. And the readers, they have their space. That's the way it works on most newspapers. But that's not how it works at the Union-Tribune, which is the principal reason, I think, that the newspaper has so little credibility in this community, so little trust. On most newspapers, the reader's space, the letters to the editor columns, is inviolable, sacrosanct. Letters reflect the balance of legitimate opinion expressed by readers. By balance, I mean letters express the balance of readers' opinion, whether they're for an issue or against an issue, whether they're for a ballpark or against it, whether they're for Donna Fry or for Dick Murphy. That's balance. By legitimate, I mean that the letters, they cannot be libelous, they cannot be obscene, they cannot be form letters, letter writing campaigns. You get lots of these. You have to weed those out. And beyond that, letters reflect what's on the reader's minds fairly. That's what they should do. On the Union-Tribune, letters are manipulated not to reflect the balance of readers' views, but to support the publisher's predilections, whether on the ballpark, the mayor's race, the Iraq War, the Bush administration. Letters manipulation was blatant during the Padres campaign for a ballpark. You can expect it again during the Chargers campaign for a ballpark. And if you think the letters published lately about Donna Fry reflect fairly the sentiment expressed by readers on Donna Fry, well, think again. Under Copley, the editorials make no attempt to be fair, enlightened, or even honest. During the mayor's race recount, before the issue of the filled bubbles came up, I modestly suggested an editorial stating that whoever got the most votes should be declared the winner. That's a pretty radical view in this town. It was too bold for them. What if Fry had the most votes, they were thinking. After campaigning for years in favor of a strong mayor system for local government, Steve Erie, you know all about that. The Union-Tribune last month, just before the election, came out against Proposition F, which happened to be for a strong mayor form of government. Now, why did it do that? Well, and it passed, by the way, thanks to an enlightened population. It did that. Why would it come out against something it had supported for so many years? Because David Copley changed his mind. Why did David Copley change his mind? 2 words, Donna Fry. By the way, the same person who had written all those editorials over the years calling for a strong mayor system wrote the editorial opposing it. Now there's a man of conscience. To conclude, let me say that censorship is what this escapade is all about. The editorials are censored, the cartoonist is censored. Steve Breen's cartoons, his best cartoons, sometimes appear all over the country in other Copley newspapers. I've seen them in the New York Times' Sunday roundup of cartoons, and it was killed in his own newspaper. I've never heard of such a thing. The reader's representative is censored. The readers are censored, and they tried to censor my column. That's the Union-Tribune. It's a newspaper where many talented journalists labor under conditions and restrictions unacceptable on most metropolitan dailies. And if my resignation helps to shed light on the unhealthy newspaper situation in our town, it's a price worth paying. Thank you. Thank you.
I will assume from your remarks that even if you were offered the chance to come back, you would decline. If you have questions, will you hold the cards up, remembering the camera? Thank you, Mr. Hess. Mr. Goldsborough, is there any hope for a consistently liberal voice, such as yours, on the UT editorial pages?
If you mean on the editorial pages, in the columns, yes. I mean, Lionel Van Deerlin is a perfect example of that. If you mean expressed in the editorials itself, that unsigned mass of type on the left, no, there's no hope whatsoever.
This person writes, I'm probably mistaken, but did one of your columns infer that you were or are a moderate Republican? Could you explain that?
I'm still a registered Republican. That's why I was hired here, because I was a moderate Republican. That was in the days when Republicans were in the middle. You know, they were progressive Republicans. Remember that beast that used to stalk the earth? We had them in California. That's the sort of Republican I was. But as the party moved way to the right and was taken over by the South and the Southern evangelists, the Democrats moved to where the Republicans are, and that's where I still am. So I will be changing my registration.
Professor Clanton would like to know, or writes, while I admire your principled resignation, have you considered the ethical implications of your depriving UT readers of your important and distinctive voice over important issues in the years ahead?
Yeah, it was very hard. It was very hard because I had done this for 13 years, and I know how much the column was appreciated, because so many of you wrote to me, and I wrote back to you. It was hard. But I did survive for 13 years, and I accomplished my major goal, which was to get through this election. So when Copley did this, I mean, you have to think of it this way. I can't sit up in my office, once he'd killed a column, writing whatever I wanted to think or say, in the back of my mind thinking, I have to get this past the publisher who's killing columns now. I mean, that is the sort of chilling effect that no newspaper man can ever accept. That's censorship. I mean, that's what we oppose. That's why we have a First Amendment. So it was a hard decision for me to do, to leave the community. But it was necessary for me to do that.
As you reflect upon your career in the profession of journalism, where do you see it going? I mean, there have been such profound changes in your lifetime and mine, not least of which, the greatest of which, is the web. But where are newspapers going?
Well, I think this gets to the heart of why I had to leave the Union-Tribune. I mean, it is declining, it is fading. In the last 10 years, I gave you the circulation figures. I mean, you can fight so hard to keep it alive, and to see the readers treated in the cavalier way that they were treated when I left it, because it was a news issue, and it was ignored by the Union-Tribune. They basically didn't care to communicate with the readers on something that was important to the readers. So this hurts newspapers, and inevitably, if they continue this way, newspapers have no chance. That's why they're losing circulation. That's why they're losing penetration. Young people, they go to the internet. They get their news on the internet. I mean, this is not a very young crowd here, is it? How many of your children read the newspaper as religiously as you did every morning at the breakfast table? So, I mean, we really have to fight to preserve our profession. And I think, as I say, if my resignation focuses some attention on the things that we have to do to survive and keep the people's trust, then it was worth doing.
Let's express our appreciation to Mr. Goldsborough.